There is a reason 12 of the wealthiest families in Robertson County, Tennessee, abandoned their surnames between 1847 and 1860. These were families who had commanded the county's courts, banks, and land for a generation. Yet, they suddenly wanted nothing to do with their own names. They scattered across 4 states, some fleeing as far as Texas and Missouri, desperate to escape something that had taken root in the autumn of 1847. What they were running from was not a plague, a war, or a financial collapse. It was a woman. Her name was Eliza Harwell, and she was born with 1 blue eye and 1 brown, a condition so rare in 1824 that many believed it meant she could perceive things hidden from others. But what ultimately unraveled those 12 families had nothing to do with superstition. It had everything to do with what Eliza actually witnessed over 23 years. What she understood about the true nature of power in Tennessee, and what she chose to do with that knowledge when the opportunity finally arrived. They called it a curse. The newspapers called it the Springfield Scandal. What makes this story so unsettling is not that Eliza Harwell possessed any supernatural power. It was that she had something these men never anticipated in an enslaved woman: access to their secrets, the intellect to comprehend them, and eventually the chance to speak. Robertson County, Tennessee, in 1824, was a landscape of contradictions. Tobacco fields stretched green and profitable under the summer sun, while the Cumberland River wound through valleys where Cherokee families had lived for generations before being pushed westward. The county seat of Springfield had grown prosperous on the backs of forced labor, its courthouse and merchant homes testifying to a wealth built on a foundation of human suffering that polite society preferred to ignore. The Harwell Plantation sprawled over 800 acres of prime bottomland, managed by Colonel James Harwell, a man whose reputation balanced precariously between respected landowner and something darker, whispered about in the quarters after the work bells fell silent. On a March morning in 1824, a child was born in the cabin row behind the main house. The midwife, an elderly woman named Ruth, had delivered 3 generations of babies, but had never seen eyes like the ones that looked up from the infant girl. One was a pale winter, sky blue, the other a deep, dark brown. The condition had a medical name, heterochromia iridis, though few in Robertson County would have known it. What they knew were stories and superstitions. Sarah, the child's mother, saw the flicker of uncertainty in the old woman's face. Having survived the Middle Passage as a child, Sarah was fluent in the subtle languages of fear and danger. She named her daughter Eliza, a strong name that sounded like it belonged to someone who mattered, and resolved to raise her as normally as possible. For her first 6 years, that plan held. But Eliza was developing a trait that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with her particular mind. She could hear a story once and repeat it back verbatim a week later. She recalled with perfect clarity conversations she had overheard years before, remembering not just events, but who was present, what they wore, the very weather. It was a gift that made her different in ways that went far beyond her unusual eyes. By the time she was assigned to work in the main house, her memory had become a subject of quiet concern. Martha, the head housekeeper, took Sarah aside one evening. "That child remembers too much," she whispered urgently. "She needs to seem ordinary, or she will draw attention she does not want." And so, Sarah began teaching her daughter the difficult art of appearing less capable than she was, a bitter lesson in self-preservation. But some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. On an August evening, when the heat lay thick over the plantation, Colonel Harwell hosted a dinner for 11 of his associates, men of influence from across the region. Eliza, small and easily overlooked, moved through the dining room refilling glasses. As the bourbon flowed, the men's words grew less guarded. She heard a land speculator boast about acquiring a widow's property for 1/3 of its value through acquired documentation. She heard a judge laugh without humor, as he described dismissing a case brought by a freedman trying to reclaim his children, citing improper filing procedures. She heard them discuss a coordinated scheme to undervalue and acquire prime farmland from struggling families. And then she heard them speak of Grace Thornhill, a free woman of color who owned 40 acres of coveted land and had refused all offers to sell. The conversation turned to how unfortunate it would be if questions arose about her father's will, or if her freedom papers were found to have irregularities. These things resolve themselves, Colonel Harwell said casually, with appropriate pressure applied in appropriate places. 2 months later, Grace Thornhill's farmhouse burned to the ground. She died in the fire. Her land was sold at auction to pay suddenly materialized debts, purchased for a fraction of its value by one of the men from that dinner. Eliza was 6 years old, but she remembered every word. She remembered the names, the connections, the casual cruelty of men who believed they operated above consequence. And she began to understand something that would shape the next 17 years of her life. Power was about information and leverage. It was about remembering when everyone else was paid or threatened into forgetting. Eliza Harwell had become an unintentional archive of corruption. From 1830 to 1838, Eliza grew into a young woman, and her memory became a known, if unsettling, quantity. Colonel Harwell began to use her ability deliberately, stationing her during sensitive conversations as a living record of his dealings. It became a parlor trick to demonstrate her recall for guests. What he did not realize was that Eliza was silently keeping track of everything, organizing it in her mind like a vast ledger. She learned the connections between the 12 men who formed the unofficial Springfield Association. They were a web of mutual interest. Colonel Harwell, the coordinator, Judge Benjamin Thornton, who ensured favorable rulings, Edward Vance, the land speculator, Robert Killebrew with his political connections, Samuel Batson, who controlled the cotton gin, William Greer, who managed the land office, Thomas Whitley, the merchant who trapped farmers in debt, Jefferson Cunningham, the banker, Henry Cartwright, who graded tobacco, Daniel Yatesman, the state legislator, Marcus Pettiford, the attorney who drafted fraudulent documents, and Alexander Darden, who ran the slave auction. Together, they controlled everything. They enriched each other through shared information and destroyed anyone who threatened their interests, using courts and contracts rather than overt violence, all while maintaining their reputations as respectable pillars of the community. By 1841, Colonel Harwell's health was failing. His son, James Harwell Jr., returned from Nashville, ambitious, educated, and reckless. Desperate to prove himself, he began using Eliza more openly, even suggesting leasing her memory to his associates. Older members of the association warned him of the danger. She already understands, the attorney Marcus Pettiford cautioned. The question is what she plans to do with that knowledge. James Jr. laughed it off. What can she do? Who would believe her? But a crisis was coming. In 1844, James Jr. lost a catastrophic sum in a fraudulent cotton speculation, fracturing the association's unity. Cornered and desperate, he made the decision that would destroy them all. He decided to sell Eliza south to Mississippi, where her knowledge and distinctive eyes would be lost forever. Eliza learned of the sale with 8 months to devise an alternative. She had no money, no legal standing, and no allies, but she had spent a lifetime watching men manipulate systems. She taught herself to write in secret. And when Reverend Thomas Walsh, a circuit preacher known for his moral sermons, came to stay, she took an enormous risk, slipping him a letter that detailed the corruption and her ability to expose it. To prove her claim, she recited his entire sermon from days earlier, word for 37 minutes. Walsh was shaken. He believed her. Help was arranged. Days before she was to be sold, a Nashville attorney representing an anti-slavery Slavery Society made James Harwell Jr. an offer $1,300 for her freedom, more than the slave trader would pay. Seeing only the financial relief, James Jr. agreed. On July 12, 1845, Eliza Harwell became a free woman under legal protection in Nashville. The association panicked. Their living archive was now beyond their reach. What followed were 3 years of legal battles known as the Robertson County cases. Eliza testified in proceeding after proceeding. She provided devastatingly precise testimony, dates, names, amounts, and exact quote, about fraudulent land seizures, manipulated court cases, and coordinated foreclosures. One by one, the empire crumbled. Edward Vance fled to Texas bankrupt. Jefferson Cunningham was forced from his bank. Samuel Batson's gin operation was sued into oblivion. Judge Thornton was removed from the bench. The Harwell plantation was foreclosed upon, and James Jr. disappeared into obscurity. The 12 families faced financial ruin, social disgrace, and exile. They had operated above consequence for 2 decades, and now consequence had arrived with perfect memory and a voice finally able to speak. Eliza Harwell lived out the rest of her life in Nashville, marrying and raising a family, her public role receding into private life. She died in 1873. No monument marks her grave. The story persists in the hidden corners of Middle Tennessee history. 12 families brought to ruin not by a curse, but by a woman they had owned and dismissed. The truth was simpler and more terrible than any supernatural explanation. Eliza Harwell remembered what others wanted forgotten, and when she finally had the chance, she spoke with such precision that the lies and corruption could no longer stand. In the end, they learned that memory could be more powerful than influence, and truth more destructive than any curse.